As we begin the final breakout session of the day, we also want to preview what's coming tomorrow.
The first event of the day is Bar Bash with Dr. Lisa Rubin. So if you're looking for a way to get in a good, quick, early workout, we hope you'll join us.
Breakout sessions tomorrow morning begin with 2 roundtable sessions. Roundtables are an imperative part of our conference and provide a great opportunity to network with others who have similar research interests.
Roundtables help support work in progress and are tremendously helpful for scholars as they continue their research.
Be sure to check out the calendar for tomorrow and create your schedule of roundtables and breakout sessions you want to attend.
Enjoy the session.
Hello, and welcome to the 2020 ASHE CAHEP Barbara Townsend Lecture. I'm Dr. Beth Bukowski, Vice Chair of the Council for the Advancement of Higher Education Programs, and I'm honored and pleased to introduce this year's Barbara Townsend Lecture. Before I introduce the lecture, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement for my institution's location in Texas. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo Camocrudo, qual, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American, Indian, and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. We'll now move on to the lecture programming. Barbara Townsend served as the ASHE Executive Director and on many other communities to improve the study of higher education for her higher education colleagues. Barbara was particularly well known for her research on community colleges, feminist studies, doctoral education, and higher education programs. In 1995, Barbara, Les Goodchild, and Bob Hendrickson co-founded the Council for the Advancement of Higher Education Programs, CAHEP. CAHEP and the larger ASHE community wanted to recall her spirit and enthusiasm for higher education programs annually with a lecture series in her honor. This year's honored speaker is Dr. Xueli Wang. Dr. Wang is the Barbara and Glenn Thompson Professor in Educational Leadership and Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Madison, Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Wang's research agenda centers on identifying factors and contexts that shape underserved students' learning, experiences, and trajectories to success. Her published scholarship has primarily advanced this area of focus through 2 interconnected strands. 1, students' participation and success in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. And 2, the access, progress, and development of students who begin post-secondary education at community colleges. In her inquiry, Dr. Wang engages in a variety of quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research designs to illuminate practices, structures, and policies toward transformative change for optimal educational opportunities and equitable outcomes. A notable example of Dr. Wang's work is her book, On My Own, published in April 2020 by Harvard Education Press. Grounded in longitudinal mixed methods research, the book unravels enduring inequities in transfer access, particularly in STEM, and issues a plan of action toward cultivating equitable STEM transfer pathways. Among her numerous awards for research and teaching, Dr. Wang was honored with the Barbara K. Townsend Emerging Scholar Award by the Council for the Study of Community Colleges in spring 2015, and received the UW-Madison School of Education's Faculty Distinguished Achievement Award in spring 2020. With no further ado, I welcome Dr. Xueli Wang.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm going to share my screen and starting with my land acknowledgements. Hello, everyone. I'm currently situated in Madison, Wisconsin. As a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I know employees, residents, and visitors often admire the natural splendor of the university. But we must acknowledge more often that this very beautiful campus, right on the shores of Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people who have called this land Daejeop since time immemorial. The UW, currently known as a land-grant institution, could not have been in existence without state and federally sponsored settler colonialism that grabbed this and other lands from Native communities. As educators, we must engage in ongoing hard work of unlearning, reflection, and action toward healing the wrongs, and collaborate with Wisconsin's 12 First Nations to fully honor and meet the critical needs they've identified for their communities. A warm hello to you all. I know that, like myself, you represent a few potentially overlapping communities: CAHEP, ASHE in general, CSCC, AERA, or broadly just the larger community of researchers and practitioners devoted to community colleges. I see you all and I appreciate you for being here. I know some of you will be watching the video later. Some of you will be joining us momentarily. I do appreciate all of you so very much. Words cannot describe. But the organization I particularly wanted to thank first and foremost is CAHEP for this incredible honor. When I was a graduate student, I was very inspired by Barbara Townsend's extensive scholarship, but particularly around community colleges and transfer. Although I never met Barbara in person, I was particularly struck by an underlining throughout her work. It is one of forward thinking, openness, reflexivity, which both inspired and resonated with me. So being named the ASHE CAHEP lecturer in her honor, joining amazing previous awardees such as Sarah Rodriguez, Pam Eddy, and Jamie Lester, among others, is one that feels surreal. Also, receiving this honor in this particular year is a profound reminder to devote my work, be it research, teaching, other day-to-day practices, where it matters the most. And what matters most to me now as a community college and transfer researcher, more than ever, is how to center equity in this line of research. So once again, thank you to CAHEP and those on the award committee for the validation, inspiration, reflection, and a deep sense of responsibility that came with this honor. But beyond the organizational level, on a more personal level, developmental level as a learner perpetually, I have a few things to say. As someone who wasn't much socialized at all during graduate school, my entry into the faculty career was untypical, to say the very least. I've always had this sense of unease or even awkwardness in finding my place and space in academia, both metaphorically and physically. Many of you have seen me at conferences knocking over bottles of water or dumping mustard all over me. That wasn't just me being physically clumsy. It was a reflection of this kind of inward awkwardness. It was Marilyn Amy who literally picked me up at a CSCC reception table, remembered how to correctly pronounce my name, both last and first names, even after 6 months, appreciated my then solely quantitative work, her being a brilliant qualitative researcher. Wait until you hear this, did not tease me when I told her that I started to do qualitative work, and she was overjoyed and actually told me that she saw my qualitative heart in my writing, and she was overjoyed I was doing qualitative work to find out why. Pamela Eddy, there are no words to describe your mentorship and friendship and what they mean to me. And even more importantly, for being who you are, not because who you are is perfect, but because you're always present. Present in your ever evolving and impactful scholarship, and present in constantly thinking about how you can do better. Last, but certainly not the least, Ebony Zamani Gallagher, thank you for leading the field of community college research in advancing equity, racial equity, and social justice. And thank you for inviting me over the years into deeply reflective spaces to collectively visualize what that could look like for community college research and practice. Your leadership, your scholarship, and your personal support to me have made a huge impact on my evolving equity-driven research. And I hope, it's cold here, but I hope you can see I'm wearing the t-shirt, Community College Scholarship, that Ebony actually designed. And I'm sure this will bring a big smile to her face. So these three extraordinary women have modeled how more advanced scholars in the community college world can gently and thoughtfully support newer colleagues like myself in finding their own place and space without imposing while still holding them accountable. Your presence in my professional life and in our field of community college research, for that matter, is monumentally important because you model that kind of forward thinking, openness, and reflexivity I mentioned earlier that are so critical to truly driving the work in equity-guided, equity-centered ways. Final important word of gratitude to the multiple intellectual communities that have supported and inspired me, including my home department at UW-Madison, ASHE, ARA, and special shout out to the Council for the Study of Community Colleges, CSCC. Excuse my omission in my thanks to all of you individually, otherwise it would be pretty much the whole lecture. Collectively, you are the space and community that allow me to just fully be and develop and grow as a community college and transfer researcher. I practiced it yesterday, so I did my crying, getting that out of my way. So as I reflected on my journey leading up to today, I was once again reminded of how, as a budding graduate student, I was deeply inspired by community college transfer students at Ohio State University, and coupled with my first introduction to what the American Community College represents and does, democratizing post-secondary education and promoting student mobility in every respect, but particularly in their transfer mission. Like many of you, I found my passion and focus as a community college researcher and never looked back. But this more than decade-long journey was not linear and was filled with new learning, unlearning, and relearning, especially in light of the place and role of equity in community college research. Looking at both my own scholarship and the larger community college research that situates and influences my work, I characterize this as a journey from dabbling with equity implications to front-centering equity, a main theme I will be unpacking throughout this lecture. Parallel to this theme is the mere fact that community colleges, despite their imperfections and inequities that need to be addressed within their own spaces, continue to lead the way in the larger post-secondary landscape. So in the final part of my lecture today, I'll also share some of my latest work on community colleges' support for students during and beyond times of crisis. As I prepared for this lecture, I practically engaged with a quick, imperfect discourse analysis of how equity has played out in the past decade of community college research, actually more precisely past 15, 20 years worth of community college research, which obviously includes and situates my work and its evolution. My thought was that we cannot envision an equity-centered future agenda for community college research without an introspective look at the past first and the very necessary unlearning that came with it. And without keeping repeating myself for the rest of my lecture, my observations and critiques, and especially my critiques, do not exonerate myself and in fact include my own work. Even though it is not the point at all, just in case any of you feel that a particular critique is directed toward some of your work, know that chances are not just only high, but guaranteed that I'm right there with you, sitting and reflecting with a necessary discomfort. Another important caveat worth mentioning is that my reflections are sufficiently narrowly focused within the domain of community college research, which deserves both ongoing growth and greater recognition and representation in the larger field of higher education studies / ASHE. But I do want to acknowledge the expertise in our larger higher education field on addressing inequities and racism. And a notable example is a recent collection of essays in the latest series published by Change magazine, featuring transformative scholars and leaders such as Estella Benjamin, D.L. Stewart, Laura Rendon, Adriana Kaiser, Sharon Fries-Britt, and many others. So this scholarship has and will continue to richly inform community college equity-driven research. So overall, my hope is that as a community, we achieve collective growth through critiques, compassion, and self-reflection. In that spirit, here are the questions I had for myself in conjunction with and after that imperfect discourse analysis that I just mentioned. I also pose these questions to you all as we're on this journey toward the future together. How have you defined and acted upon equity in your research and practice in regard to community colleges? What would you do differently now and beyond the year of 2020? So how has equity played out in community college research in the early 2000s, with some of the influences still very present today? First, equity is primarily framed by access. From both within and without, open access of community colleges is equated to serving the equity agenda, often citing a disproportionately larger number of student populations who wouldn't have had the opportunity to access post-secondary education. When describing equity concerns, however, the narrative centered around low numbers of transfer and completion rates, often without purposeful disaggregation of the data, with the suggestion that these low rates mean that the equity agenda was not realized. With regard to equity solutions, structural types of reform dominated the spotlight and resources. These reforms tend to adopt a neutral stance with the explicit or implicit assumptions that they will be in service to all students. In terms of the mentalities that all, of course, trickle down to our practices as researchers, we used to, or may still have, this very innocent assumption that because we do work on community colleges and transfer, we of course are doing equity work. And this is something that's just second nature. That may sound familiar to you. My slightly younger self certainly had thought that way. So what have I learned and unlearned about what was and what still is to quite some extent? In the community college context, college completion agenda has, at least in their earlier iterations, they were constructed in such a way it posed inherent tensions with a true equity agenda. Pushing all students to reach completion metrics imposed by the traditional college success model oppresses the rich diversity of roles, values, and goals with regard to community colleges and their students. Largely because of that, these structural reforms do not touch upon educational spaces plagued by inequitable access, experiences, and outcomes. And assuming equity is second nature and inherent to our work, just because we do work in the community college space, is dangerous because I view this as essentially an equity blind approach. I wanted to unpack this a little bit more through a personal experience. This is something I briefly shared in an earlier ASHE presidential webinar this year, so excuse me if you're hearing this twice, but I'm compelled to share this again in its full version because it's quite telling. So earlier this year, I participated in a meeting in my capacity as an advisory board member to a project with the goal to boost transfer in a STEM area study led by a collaborative team involving both ends of the transfer process. The project description referenced equity as focus. During the 4-hour virtual interview in the meeting with the advisory board, I learned a great deal about the tremendous hard work the team had put into this initiative. They talked about new prerequisites, a new competency test, and working across institutions. But something I was holding my breath for was missing. So finally, I posed the question, could you speak about how your project addresses issues of equity in transfer? It took a while for me to get any response. And based on what I could tell from the looks of the colleagues who had their video on, it was not because my question was so spot on or so profound they were lost in thought, but rather they were the looks saying, has she not been listening at all? At last, a faculty colleague on the 4-year team, a STEM disciplinary faculty colleague on the 4-year team responded, but we work with community colleges, we work with transfer students. They're the most diverse institutions and students. So of course we're addressing equity. I didn't have the time to tell the story in full in my ASHE webinar, but here you go. I said to the colleague and others, I'm smiling and nodding because what you said resonated deeply with me, especially earlier in my research career. But I've learned and unlearned things about equity that challenged myself to do better and to revisit that assumption in order to truly support all transfer students. I then shared with the team as a follow-up that what I was really hoping for them to think through and discuss is how these new prerequisites, new tests, and partnership building are intentionally taking into consideration things like, among the diverse transfer intending students, who gets access to these so-called new opportunities and who may not, and for whom these new opportunities are in fact additional new barriers at the structural level and not because the students are not capable. And for the transfer partnership, is there intentional discussion based on uneven institutional resources around who should step up to put in more work in support of transfer instead of assuming either a completely equal distribution of labor, or worse yet, community colleges should be taking the primary responsibility. So the moral of this story, along with what I recognized as limitations in some of my own prior work, is that well-intended equity blindness. Dangerous is probably too strong of a word, but to say the very least, this approach is not well aligned with our genuine intent to promote the equity for community colleges and their students. And we all fell in love with these institutions and students, so we can and should always do better. These kinds of equity blind approaches may practically perpetuate inequities as we bypass a deliberate process where we must name inequities in their specific contextualized forms in order to reduce them. On that note, as a precondition to doing equity-centered work, equity needs to be defined and contextualized, as Ebony has always pushed us. The definitions will rightfully vary across researchers and research contexts, so I intentionally leave this open as an evolving question and charge for all of us as individual researchers. But then in a more collective sense, how is and should equity be defined and enacted in our work? What is happening in the current community college work that inspires me? Before I share my 4 cents here, a serious shout out to the slightly newer generation of community college scholars, by no means junior, who embody what should be in various ways through their research and our work with community college partners. You all inspire me. This is an incomplete shout out. Erin Doran, Sarah Rodriguez, Elvira Abrica, Xiaodan Hu, Lorenzo Baber, April Chen, Lauren Schutte, Daryl Hatch, Chris Salinas, Frederick Neal, Matt Gianni, John Fink, Jason Taylor, and numerous others. Your individual and collective work is a huge part of the foundation and inspiration for what is and should be. First, while access is still part of the anchor, when discussing the role of community colleges in advancing equity in the larger post-secondary context, there has been some good attention to community college contribution in nonlinear ways. These include the positive contributions of community college attendance, regardless of where students started college. But more importantly, there has been more contextualization of the so-called disparities within systemic barriers, instead of within students' individual attributes and backgrounds. There has also been more explicit naming of inequities, and extremely importantly, racial inequities and injustices and racism as a root cause. Related, neutral stance is being challenged and disrupted when it comes to new policy and practice meant to bolster student success. meaning that doing equity work, as some say, on top of a given policy does not do the work, as we must name and embed equity efforts explicitly from the get-go. What I shared so far is definitely not exhaustive of everything about equity the past 15, 20 years worth of community college research has to say, not even just my own learning and unlearning in this direction. But in the interest of time, I want to talk about what could be. I ask myself, and now I'm asking all of my scholar friends here, how can I, or how can my or our research shed light on how to level the playing field more than and before anything else? What and whose story am I missing that have major implications for inequities? And how can I do better? These questions led me to wrestle with some of the good challenges ahead we could tackle in order to truly center equity in our research. These challenges are inherently intertwined, but they also reside along a unique dimension of their own for us to make sense of them. By the way, I found a lot of synergy and inspiration in the notion of discretionary spaces in Carrie-Anne's thought-provoking presidential address this morning. I see its applicability within the research context too. So as we think about these dimensions, they also could represent the kinds of discretionary spaces for us community college researchers to be reflexively responsible in our choices of what we enact or don't. I will unpack these a little bit more briefly later, but to give a high-level overview, how do we ensure equity-guided policy research makes a tighter connection between the structural and the experiential? How do we highlight students and community colleges' assets and strengths while at the same time equally strongly identifying the supports they need? As researchers working with many types of data, including institutional research data, how do we make sure that all types of data are critically interrogated and critically contextualized? As for the process of conducting our research, how do we do full justice to centering equity and follow through all the way, including but not limited to the what, why, how, and so what? Speaking of so what, how do we enact equity-driven change by cultivating community? And how do we do that in equitable, reciprocal, and generative ways? So briefly more on each of those. Policy research that used to speak to equity on top of the general findings can benefit from equity-guided and centered frameworks. Otherwise, we run the risk of scraping the surface and perpetuating the so-called unintended consequences. A brief quantitative example is the use of human capital theory, followed by a set of moderation analysis based on race, gender, and SES, and so on. Although this approach does have some equity implications, if we want to center equity, a better alternative, for example, is to have critical theory, such as critical race theory, social reproduction theory, depending on context, to lead the way. Also, policy has been narrowly construed at the macro level as if it didn't trickle down to practitioner and student experiences. The most useful for me is the kinds of policy research that connects all facets of a community college policy, such as developmental education transfer, that students and community colleges both navigate and are affected by. So integrating micro, meso, and macro levels of policy analysis allows us to see the whole picture and system at work. This slide contains something deeply personal. I've been contending with this conundrum, finding that perfect spot or balance that allows my research to both elevate the assets that community colleges and their students are, and hit home the supports that these institutions and students need, and doing both together in non-compromising ways. Some of you know that I've been doing a longitudinal mixed method study following transfer intending students that culminated in my recent book called On My Own. This On My Ownness really summarizes key equity challenges with transfer. It shows that structural barriers created inequities massively experienced by students of color and other minoritized students. But it also illustrates the immense assets these students were as they pushed through structural barriers. A key challenge for me writing this book was the conundrum I mentioned earlier, but I always went back to an email I received from a study participant after our interview. She also requested and read a couple of project publications already. So among many profoundly insightful and moving things that are too precious for me to put on the slide, this is part of what she said in her email. Thank you for doing this research. Thank you for searching for a meaningful and actionable understanding of the challenges that exist for community colleges. Most of all, thank you for seeing the humanity in the process and recognizing that we're women who have goals and face obstacles and need help. So what I learned from her and honestly all the students in my study and working on this book is this sense of urgency in our collective research in both highlighting student perseverance in charting their own success and naming and working to remove the structural barriers. The next important facet is data. As researchers and in collaboration with practitioner colleagues, equity-centered work can't be done without data. However, data without critical contextualization do more harm than help. First, what is behind data or driving the data is invisible to the naive eye. For instance, in the quantitative domain and also the community college institutional research world, with good intentions and new learning, there has been a lot more focus on data disaggregation, especially when it comes to research and evaluation for high-stake, high-impact policy and practices, or at least intendedly. However, data disaggregated by race, for example, without guided reflection and discussion of what's behind the data, contribute little to advancing racial equity. So it is very important to contextualize data within structural opportunities or lack thereof, or the pervasive nature of racism. Otherwise, disaggregated data by race, for instance, run the risk of reinforcing stereotypes. And more experientially, as well-intended researchers and practitioners, when looking at these data, we must also look inwardly and introspectively within our own practices and mindsets to disrupt them. Frankly, sometimes these racial disparities we saw in the data are a reflection of our own action or non-action on a daily basis. Finally, data always take on new creative forms that stretch our learning and imagination. I like good statistics, but I value even more qualitative data and applied mixed methods research, among other things, that not only give full meaning to statistics, but more importantly, stand on their own and tell a more complete story. Although this next slide on process has implications for practice, its analysis is primarily situated within the research process. With me as both a relearning researcher and as a reviewer across multiple feedback contexts, formal or informal, but I promise I'm not that reviewer too. So in these capacities, I've been observing what is promising and what is a little bit wanting in the process of conducting equity-centered community college research. First, it is incredibly important yet challenging to do critical research well, qualitative critical work, quantitative critical work, or other types of critical research. But I truly believe conducting, or at the very least becoming a very well-informed consumer of critical research and theory is a vital part of the process toward fully realizing the potential of equity-guided community college research. In that light, I see a strong need for the field to do a better job aligning the theoretical and empirical. Earlier, I mentioned the potential mismatch between human capital theory and claiming research to be centering equity as an example. As another example, and I see this quite a lot in studies that rely on critical quantitative analysis, is when researchers started out super strong in the theoretical, but either the extent the quantitative databases have inherent limitations that it would not allow the empirical to match the theoretical, or even in some cases of original data collection, it did not include measures that examine systems of power, structural barriers, or student assets. While these limitations required significant reform and resources, in the immediate now, framing and interpretations within critical perspectives are still important in pushing this boundary. Related, we must be cognizant of what the most robust, so-called robust methods cannot tell. For example, when studying student outcomes in light of an intervention, we may account for race through moderation or control variables. And when we see a p-value that is larger than 0.05, we may conclude that the intervention works and race doesn't matter. It does. It didn't evolve to be statistically significant because students of color often possess higher levels of aspirations and resilience that allow them to persist despite structural barriers. So these were hard to quantify, and that's often not accounted for in the analysis. So a final issue here is sense-making of the so what. In my view, as we continue to point out systemic issues and the need for systemic change, we also need to engage in research topics or findings that get at the immediate now and the immediate near future. So really addressing the actionability of the so what. Further speaking to following through in terms of the research process, here are some of the questions I'm putting out there in terms of the kinds of research questions or related so what questions we could ask to drive our equity agenda for community college research. Of course, they require appropriate and very specific contextualization depending on the specific topics. How are inequities manifested? What causes them at the systemic level? How are they experienced by students, faculty advisors, community colleges, etc.? What immediate action can and should ensue to address those? How do we tackle the friction inequitably experienced by students in the so-called organic educational spaces? How are equity-guided policy and practice communicated, enacted upon, interpreted, and implemented? Whether and how do they benefit students in equitable ways? So we do research with equity as a process towards social justice and change. How do we facilitate change? Among the many possibilities, I see community building vital, especially when we approach it through equitable, reciprocal, and generative partnerships. I get that we get easily frustrated with ourselves and others when trying to do equity work, but I think if we approach these different types of partnerships and community building with critical love and loving critiques, we could make incremental progress toward realizing the big change. I think about community in several ways. First, within the community college research community, we have and we'll continue to push ourselves and one another through that perpetual reflexivity and openness. Thinking about our journey, it is not about doing it right. It is about ongoing learning, unlearning, and relearning. And in collaboration with community college partners, we must ensure that community colleges' priorities, knowledge, and input are at the forefront as research questions are being collaboratively developed and framed. And when working with institutions that can provide researchers access to the populations of research interest, really think about making this a true partnership rather than just accessing research sites. Especially when working with under-resourced community colleges, consider ways to build in tangible resources. My experiences so far have proven that this approach is not just fairly well received by funders or your department, depending on your initiatives, but these kinds of genuine and serious investments in our community college partners can truly lead toward incremental positive changes. I also want to call on baccalaureate institutions who not only receive transfer students, but also have their non-transfer students benefit from community colleges through co-enrollment and such. My wonderful friend, Gloria Crisp, how could I have forgotten to give you a big shout out, and has done really interesting work on this regard. So we know community colleges contribute to the larger post-secondary experience, regardless the type of institutions. We must step up as four-year institutions if we're serious about equity, and we must view community colleges and us together as vital partners in the higher education ecosystem. Plus, there's so much to be learned from community colleges in just general, every single regard. Indeed, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we watch and learn from community colleges, especially during the current crises. My most recent research taught me that amid times of crisis, community colleges are once again rising to the occasion. I share these findings briefly to say that we can critique the imperfections all we want out of love, but community colleges are precisely the same institutions all higher ed should look up to, and they deserve much greater recognition and public support. So from interviews with over 30 some current and past community college attendees over the summer, I learned how their community college education helped them cope with the current pandemic. Essentially, students really praised their community colleges for cultivating educational opportunities or spaces that prepared them well for coping with the current pandemic. So key things they took away from their community college education experiences include the practicality of their training and research capacity in terms of how to identify and engage credible sources to research well-informed judgments and to reach well-informed judgments and decisions during COVID. Technology and communication skills they gained in virtual formats from their community college times, the resilience they gained, exposure to diversity that brings them to a deeper level of understanding of both the pandemic and systemic inequities and racism, and along with an education for the community that helped them develop a strong sense to give back. For more detail, you can actually check out this Inside Higher Education article that just came out this morning, so the timing could not be more perfect. In that article, I described these findings in some greater detail. Also, speaking to the community college contribution and the assets they are and their students are, I wanted to leave you with a quote from Kanda, one of my study participants. She identifies as a Native American woman. She was an IT student when attending her community college. She had an almost perfect academic record, always wanted to transfer, but had to defer and take a job because of the lack of financial support for transfer and also in support to her family. In my most recent communication with her during the summer this year, she was gearing up to possibly extend her education while still working full-time. And this is what she said to me over Zoom as she reflected on her past 6 years since she initially participated in the study as a first-year community college student. Kanda said, I know having attended my college and participating through the study, it made me think how I can be the change in tech. It's giving me a lot of ideas about how to improve diversity in tech, really promoting pathways through two-year colleges, especially being a woman, being Native American, and really wanting to promote the background of what I can see our future of technology could be like, because we can't build the future unless we have the future fully represented in it. In closing, as I think about our collective journey toward the future of an equity-guided and equity-centered community college and transfer research, I view ourselves, or at least myself in my own effort to front center equity, to be never perfect, ever learning, ever changing, and always reflective. And isn't that part of the community college spirit? These colleges always lead the way. They were never perfect. They are ever adaptive. They are ever changing. They're always socially responsive and responsible. They, along with Kanda and her countless peers, have been my inspiration and have propelled me to always try to do better. So finally, a totally biased and shameless plug for my book on my own. I was never this excited about my work precisely because of the unlearning and new learning and relearning I experienced when I worked on this research and this book. And also, if you're a new friend here, whether you're a student or a faculty or practitioner colleague who wants to connect beyond this particular space, feel free to reach out to me via my email contact here. With that, my friends, I look forward to your questions and thoughts and ideas.
Thank you so much, Xueli. There we go. And we'll invite anyone who would like to ask a question either to put it into the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself, I think. We have a question from Marilyn Amy. The importance of developing partnerships is critical from both the practice and research perspectives. Since community colleges still often are seen as other/less than by 4 years, how to better encourage faculty/administrators to see these relationships as critical and not just a revenues or numbers resource?
Yeah, I'm so glad, Marilyn, you had a very good question for me, and also that it's reassuring. Apparently there's a different venue through which folks are joining this session in addition to Zoom, because I don't see Marilyn here. Absolutely. I think there are two sides of partnership building in terms of how to not just incentivize, but ensure for your colleagues do take this seriously. So you mentioned some of the revenue aspects, that part, unfortunately will always be one of the drivers, and that's not going to go away, but we have to be doing more, and there has to be more. One of the more is around the point I was making in terms of much more broadly and presently advocating for the contributions community colleges made, not just in terms of sending transfer students, but also in terms of how much is being, kind of shared in terms of what community colleges have offered in terms of their course offerings and such. So broadening the perspective of who together contributes to students and the experiences primarily situated within the, for lack of a precise term, 4-year baccalaureate space. And so viewing them as vital partners to ensuring this more holistic success of all students, regardless of sectors. So I think the contributions of these institutions need to be much more broadly accessible and publicized, but really viewing this as beyond the linear transfer supply. I think another very, very important aspect to mention, like I said, I mentioned two sides. One is sort of, the incentives, but it is really around appealing to the real well-intended colleagues at the 4-year end for doing the right things the right way. So we all know, just saying the right things, performing the right ways will not cut it. But I genuinely believe, in my personal experiences working across institutions, there are very, very well-intended 4-year partners who want to do the right things, but then they were not necessarily provided the right kinds of knowledge, research-informed, but accessible knowledge around, how do I check my assumptions and how do I become more reflexive reflective. So I think that's really part of our own responsibilities as researchers, and to offer that kinds of access in terms of well-informed resources and knowledge, so that they can practice that reflexivity and just realizing they're not just like helping, and doing the right things. They're actually benefiting hugely from that, but also they will be working through their own biases. And a final thing I will say, I hate to use the word accountability, but I think equity work, if we want to drive real change, it has to be part of the accountability system across all, bigger or smaller levels. And then, you're being viewed or reviewed based on some of the imperfect, but still nonetheless indicators of your work is really well aligned with what you say about equity. So here's a question in the chat. What recommendations do you have for researchers working in the community college space to make our findings more accessible to students and practitioners? How do we find the scholar-practitioner balance in our work? Yeah, this is so difficult, and this is so important to do. So I think in terms of recommendations, we have such amazing expertise within this space, talking about how to develop partnerships. But experientially, I will say that kind of relationship building, that trust building, is a very important precondition and prerequisite to ensuring that practitioner colleagues actually want to invite you into their spaces to share the findings. I feel oftentimes, at least in my personal experiences, it's not necessarily the balance. I get the balance in terms of scholar-practitioner balance. It's very difficult to navigate because then there's a lot of time commitment, which may or may not factor into the current imperfect system if you are a faculty member, for instance, in higher ed. But for me, I didn't feel the problem is so much so in terms of balance per se. I feel it's really that kind of trust and that genuine relationship that could lead the way. Because once that is established, a researcher can go into or be invited into practitioner spaces and just do our presentation, and with some good contextualization and reflection, the practitioner colleagues have so much wisdom to offer, so they don't need to be kind of working with fully unpacked, super down-to-earth kinds of language. Many of them resonate with some of the research findings very well, and we all write about implications. But the gist of your question regarding recommendations, and since I mentioned trust and relationship building as a precondition, my recommendations about building trust and developing relationships is beyond just being a good person, being a kind person. It's actually, again, do something tangible, meaning that if you're writing a grant, don't just think about incentives for your study participants. Think about ways in which justifiably you can commit some serious resources to your community college partners. Say, if you're studying faculty development, it's a very justifiable ask to write in your grant professional development money that can really buy faculty time without assuming that they just should do this work because it's good, because research has shown this is going to be effective, right? So I think investing not just our heart, but our heart has to translate into some tangible resources. But money aside, is not just money or resources per se in the physical sense. It's also how you chose to communicate with your partners. Do you call them, I always call them partners, and all kinds of communication. But I think more substantively, meetings need to be happening on their campuses, in their offices, rather than scheduling things that are centered around where we are situated. So these are just some very imperfect examples about building that trust and rapport. But then again, going back to what I mentioned in response to Marilyn's question, good heart coupled with very tangible indicators of demonstrating that good heart. Yeah, I have a question from Brett. Xueli, you talk about the power of reflection. What can each of us do in our individual roles, engage in and encourage fellow scholars, faculty, leaders, practitioners, and students to practice more meaningful and critical reflections that drive more equitable measures in community colleges and beyond? So Brett, definitely this is a fantastic question and definitely requiring a much more intense conversation between the two of us, right? So we have that capacity for that conversation to happen. But I really think sometimes, talking about reflexivity makes sense, but practicing reflexivity is very difficult. So I think it depends on a first deep reflection of the kinds of thinkers and learners that you are. And this is something we can give ourselves honest answers to. For instance, I would ask myself, do I tend to interrogate my writings, my work numerous times, not out of my imposter syndrome, but rather, am I missing something important here? And whose very important perspectives or ideas am I not relaying in my writing or in my speaking in any kinds of research context? So, or do I tend to be pretty linear in my productive route and to say, finish version 1, read for typos, grammar and cogency, and then I ended up feeling pretty happy about what I've done in how I approach my research. So if your questions, if you answer these questions in honest ways, you will be realizing whether mostly on your own, you will be a reflective, you will practice a lot of these reflexivity, or you might need a critical friend to help you with that, and I hope the two sort of, styles, kinds of example make sense. So I think, aligning our approaches toward reflexivity with our very, very honest styles and tendencies when it comes to learning. Actually, I think everyone has a good sense of how open they are to new things. And so you have to have that honest conversation with yourself first and foremost. And this applies across context. I know you laid out many contexts in your questions. So here's another question in the chat, related question from those watching the live stream. How have you developed your reflective skills? I found students often struggle to develop reflexivity. I don't want to be super repetitive, I think, but I want to offer this experientially. I used to be very naive in thinking that reflexivity is something everyone has. And I will say pretty honestly, and this sounds like a brag, but it's I don't think it is, because I do just question everything that I do, not because I was questioning my grammar as such. It's more about is this, how much bias is there in my writing and in my speaking? So, and I used to think, experientially, I am reflexive, apparently, just so I told all my students and colleagues, and say, be more reflective in your writing and such. And then I realized that, see, this is part of my reflexivity. It dawned on me that I was assuming this much, and I was assuming sameness in terms of cultivating, in terms of reflexivity, just as something very innate. So, so I would just add this experiential observation to acknowledge the value and importance of this question about the difficult nature to cultivate reflexivity. And I no longer thought reflexivity is just something, if you were told about it, you will cultivate that. So I think contextualizing our own circumstances in terms of developing some strategies and steps that support but not intimidate our students in terms of cultivating that reflexivity incrementally.
The next question, which I'll also add to the chat, is what are some tangible ways that we can eliminate community college stigma? How do four-year partners do this? Researchers, educational policy people?
Yes, yes, yes. This is another phenomenal question. And this is something also, I'm also trying new ways and different ways to achieve that in my very limited capacity as a researcher. I think, it was impossible for me to imagine even several years ago to say write for the popular media and to get the community college love more out in the policy world and then in the popular media world. I'm doing this still very imperfectly, but my personal reflection in light of this question, one of the tangible ways for us as researchers is to maybe without investing a huge amount of new energy and efforts especially for fairly earlier career friends and who are on the tenure track, but still when you are crafting the implications for your research papers and think about even broader accessibility beyond the journal, your target journal, and to think about, how would this findings, especially if it's something highlighting community colleges as assets, and that could be almost as a good byproduct, be developed into an op-ed that goes into a more popularly, broadly accessible media outlets. And my imperfect but still very rewarding experiences over this past year was writing a few of such pieces, and I got an enormous amount of feedback from readers I never met in person, never knew in person, and so I felt this is one of the tangible ways in which we can and at least we can contribute to ending community college stigma by highlighting their assets and then the ways in which their assets. I think then how do four-year partners do this? And this is still, go brag about transfer students, go brag about your connections with the local community colleges, any chance you got. And exposure, one of my degrees was in linguistics. So this exposure, I+1, always, with input, you always add a little bit more exposure. With repeated exposure, we started to cultivate awareness.
One more question for you. I've just added it to the chat.
Okay.
How do you propose to consistently align and update curricular programming between community colleges and four-year partners? We have some MOUs, but not a holistic process.
Yeah, this is, this reminded me, I am literally lost in thought, because this question was one of the key findings out of my book that completely disrupted my preconceived set of findings when I started to work on this this book on my own, I just mentioned. But this is totally not a plug for my book at all, because I was, because your question here, the colleague's question here is, how do you consistently align and update your curricular programming between, and I assume you're talking about program level articulation, but sometimes it's not. What I found from my own research and practice is that often it's not what is seamless, what is purposeful, what is holistic on paper. It is really about that kind of sort of responsive and very sensitive and mindful kind of compassion and support when it comes to supporting students navigating anything perfect on paper that is actually very hard experientially to navigate. And I'm not even just talking about, I haven't even started to talk about how inaccurately sometimes these MOUs and policy got interpreted by well-intended faculty and advisors, and then imagine how that set of inaccuracies trickle down to student sense-making and the resulting actions and steps they take. So I think it is definitely important to continue to align and update curriculum and such. But I think where you're coming from also gives this question a good answer in terms of a holistic process. I view this holistic process still hinging upon this notion of trust and rapport building, but in this case, particularly between faculty colleagues on both ends of transfer. And so when we do talk about the curriculum alignment, we need to pause and must first address the power dynamics that had long been in existence between and around articulation agreements and how they were cultivated, developed between community colleges and four-year institutions. So I think that holistic process is not just at the structural level, but rather viewing education across community colleges spanning 4 years as not as hierarchical, but rather as holistic as you say, and not from junior to senior or lower level to higher level, but rather from foundational at the community college, and then more, foundational and then more foundational. So we have to really think about frame our dialogues and partnerships around language coming from mindsets that are really committed to this equitable and equal sense of partnership.
The next question is, I think we need people at both 2-year and 4-year institutions to really champion transfer. How can the field develop more transfer champions in faculty and administrative ranks?
Yeah, this reminds me of a fantastic transfer partnership led by our wonderful scholar colleague and friend, Jason Taylor. So Jason can jump in to answer this question. But I was very much inspired as I participated in the Transfer Summit in Utah. They were really hitting all the right marks in light of this question. I think that has to start off with very top leadership in that particular transfer partnership. Dr. Taylor has led the president's top level leadership were both involved, both in terms of the messaging they send, but also in their actual participation in the summit. So once you have top leadership that is demonstrably committed, the rest of the way is being paved to quite some extent. So, and then of course, related to top level leadership commitment, that kind of commitment would have to involve, again, very tangible, sort of like putting money where your mouth is kinds of investments, and meaning that, again, we can call on colleagues to champion transfer partnerships on both ends simply because you should be doing the right things. Of course, you love community colleges, you love students, and so, why don't you? But so their time needs to be accounted for in the reward system, in the review system. So again, I don't necessarily shy away from the use of the word accountability, like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to equity. So I'll just say those two first important things: top leadership and tangentially related real money where the mouth is. But Jason Taylor has fantastic lessons to offer and insights.
The last question is not a question, it is, but it's been upvoted by several people, and it is, thanks Xueli, also great article in today's Inside Higher Ed. We have about 4 minutes left. If anyone does have one more question, we probably have time for it, either in the live stream or in the room chat. Otherwise, I'll simply ask Xueli to, Dr. Wang, to make some concluding remarks.
I was not given that instruction.
Nothing big, just,
Yeah, I was, Beth, you made this whole experience so comfortable and feel safe for me. And so see, I'm no longer socially awkward because of your excellent contribution to this whole process. I truly, truly mean that, all the way from the notification to how you moderated this whole discussion. I'm really, really grateful to you. And so concluding remarks, I just love you all. To my CSCC colleagues, big love to each and every single one of you. And of course, my UW community, but all my new and old friends or friends yet to be made who do work on community colleges, not just on, but with and for community colleges. And I hope we're always going to be in community with one another, with critical love, and don't shy away from providing critical feedback with love as well. So I guess, I just rambled a couple of things as closing remarks. But it was such a wonderful, this is the highlight of my year. I'm extraordinarily appreciative of everything. I'm gonna cry, so I'm done.
Yes, a couple other remarks. This was a wonderful session. Thank you, Dr. Wang, for this and all your work, including your excellent book. We are very pleased to be able to honor you and your work, Dr. Wang. I hope everyone can go out. Yep. There's the wonderful award. Yay, it arrived.
Yeah, Jason, and thanks to Jason and Ash, and who sent this just in time. I was just so touched opening this in my mail over the weekend. Yeah, so speechless.
Well, it is a pleasure having everyone here, both who are in the room and those who are watching the live stream. And it looks like we have 1 minute left, so you have 1 extra minute in order to go take care of anything before the next session starts. So have a wonderful day and take care.
Bye, everyone.